They say a bullet doesn't ask for a name, but in the dark alleys of Seoul, names are the only thing that keep you alive. It doesn't care if you are an innocent or a kingpin. But that night, overlooking the neon sprawl of Gangnam, the bullet was meant for the Shadow King himself. It was meant for Kwon Jae-hoon, the man who ruled the underworld with obsidian eyes and iron discipline. Instead, it found her, a quiet tutor, a ghost in a city of millions. A woman with every reason to hide, but who chose to become a shield. Why? Because of the two small souls standing behind him. This is the story of how Clara Thorne took a hit meant for a legend, and how that one choice exposed the rot at the heart of an empire. You think you know sacrifice. You think you know worth. Wait until you see the radiant shield of the underworld. The humid heat of Seoul didn't offer comfort. It just made the tension thicker. It was a Tuesday night in July, the kind of stifling air that makes the heart race before the first drop of blood hits the floor. Clara Thorne adjusted the strap of her modest bag as she stepped toward the private elevator. She was exactly on time. Subscribe to this channel to keep getting exciting stories. The humid heat of Seoul didn't offer comfort. It just made the tension thicker, a physical weight that pressed against the glass towers of Gangnam. It was a Tuesday night in July, the kind of stifling air that makes the heart race before the first drop of blood hits the floor. Clara Thorne adjusted the strap of her modest bag as she stepped toward the private elevator of the Bright Star Academy. She was exactly on time, her soft, honey-blonde hair pulled back into a professional bun that felt as tight as the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Clara was a woman who moved through the world in beige and cream, a deliberate choice to remain part of the background. At 26, she had mastered the art of being invisible. To the elite parents of the city, she was the radiant shield of their children's education, a tutor who could turn a struggling student into an Ivy League candidate with nothing but patience and a soft voice. But behind the expressive blue eyes that reflected a deep, innate empathy, Clara was drowning. Her father's medical debts had followed her like a shadow from London to Seoul, and everyone she earned was already promised to a bank that didn't care about her grace or her goodness. The elevator doors slid open with a silent, expensive hiss, revealing the penthouse floor. Usually, the academy was filled with the low hum of air conditioning and the distant chatter of wealthy teenagers. Tonight, it was silent, dead silent. Two men in charcoal suits stood like stone pillars outside the main study suite, their earpieces glinting under the recessed lights. They didn't move as she approached, their eyes tracking her with a cold, professional detachment that made her skin prickle. She pushed the door open and froze. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, silhouetted against the neon sprawl of the city, was a man who looked less like a shipping mogul and more like a predator carved from granite. Kwon Jae-hoon, the man the tabloids whispered about as the Shadow King, didn't turn immediately. He remained still, his broad shoulders and lean, athletic build filling the frame of the window. He wore a bespoke midnight blue three-piece suit that fit him like armor, the fabric shimmering under the lights. "You're late," he said. His voice was a low, melodic growl that vibrated in Clara's chest. "I am exactly on time, Mr. Kwon," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. She checked her vintage watch. 6 o'clock to the second. Jae-hoon turned then, and Clara felt the air leave the room. His features were sharp and angular, his jawline looking as though it had been honed by years of discipline and danger. But it was his eyes, piercing, dark obsidian, that held her captive. They were cold, unreadable, and currently fixed on her with a clinical intensity. He moved toward her with a predatory efficiency, his gait smooth and silent. As he drew closer, she noticed the top button of his white shirt was undone, revealing the edge of intricate, dark tattoos that crawled up his neck like rising smoke. "Punctuality is a requirement, not a suggestion," he said, stopping just inches from her. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco rolled off him, a masculine scent that was as intimidating as his stature. He looked down at her, his height making her feel fragile, though she refused to shrink back. On his pinky, a heavy platinum signet ring caught the light, a symbol of a legacy she didn't yet understand. "I understand," Clara said, her blue eyes meeting his dark ones. "But if we are to discuss your children's curriculum, perhaps we should focus on the students rather than the clock." A flicker of something, amusement, curiosity, passed through Jae-hoon's expression before the ice returned. He gestured to the corner of the room where two small figures sat at a low table. Theo and Tessa were a perfect blend of their father's intensity and a haunting, quiet innocence. Theo, dressed in a miniature blazer that mirrored his father's stoicism, was meticulously lining up colored pencils. Tessa, in a soft, lace-trimmed dress, clutched a stuffed rabbit with a desperation that made Clara's heart ache. They didn't look like children of a billionaire. They looked like children who were used to living in a fortress. "They don't speak much," Jae-hoon said, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second as he looked at them. "They've had 3 tutors in as many months. None of them stayed past the first week." "Why?" Clara asked, stepping toward the twins. "Because they are afraid of me," Jae-hoon stated simply, as if it were a law of nature. "And the children sense that fear, they become difficult." Clara knelt beside Tessa, ignoring the heavy gaze of the Shadow King behind her. She didn't reach out to touch the girl. She simply sat on the floor, her cream-colored skirt fanning out around her. She took a small, hand-carved wooden bird from her bag and placed it on the table between them. "I'm not afraid of you, Mr. Kwon," Clara said quietly, her eyes remaining on the children. "I've spent my life dealing with things much scarier than a man in a suit. Debt, illness, and the silence of a city that doesn't care if you live or die. A suit is just fabric." Jae-hoon watched her, his arms crossing over his chest. The Ayers-Yumi-style sleeves beneath his suit jacket shifted, the dark ink of dragons and crashing waves hidden just beneath the silk. He saw the way she didn't flinch when he moved, the way she prioritized the comfort of his heirs over the intimidation of his presence. For the first time in a long time, the man who saw everyone as a chess piece or a threat found himself looking at a variable he couldn't calculate. "We start tomorrow," Jae-hoon said, his voice dropping an octave. "My driver will collect you at 6. Do not be late, Miss Thorne. My world does not offer second chances, and my children are the only things in it that are not for sale." He turned and walked out, his presence leaving a vacuum in the room. Clara exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at the twins, who were now staring at the wooden bird with wide, curious eyes. Thea reached out a small hand, touching the carved wing. She was a tutor drowning in debt, a nobody in a city of giants. She didn't know then that she had just walked into the center of a storm. She didn't know that the man in the charcoal suit was the devil of the underworld, or that in 48 hours she would be bleeding on a marble floor to save the only things he loved. All she knew was that, for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The neon lights of Seoul flickered outside, reflecting in the dark obsidian of the window, a silent omen of the blood and fire to come. Clara picked up a blue pencil and handed it to Theo. The lesson had begun, but the real education, the one involving loyalty, bullets, and the true worth of a soul, was only just starting. The Grand Burnham Hotel was a monument to old money and new power, its gilded ceilings and crystal chandeliers reflecting the shimmering silk of Seoul's most dangerous elite. For the inaugural gala of the Kwon Foundation, the air was thick with the scent of expensive orchids and the underlying metallic edge of hidden firearms. Clara stood in the shadows of a marble pillar, her cream-colored silk blouse a soft contrast to the sharp, dark suits of the security detail. Beside her, Theo and Tessa were restless. Theo tugged at his miniature lapels, his small face set in a mimicry of his father's stoicism, while Tessa gripped Clara's hand, her small fingers trembling slightly against Clara's palm. Across the ballroom, Kwon Jae-hoon was the center of gravity. He moved through the crowd with a predatory grace, his charcoal suit molding to his broad shoulders. Every time he spoke, men leaned in with practiced deference, their eyes darting to the Ayers-Yumi tattoos that peeked from his cuffs, the silent mark of the Shadow King. Occasionally, his obsidian gaze would cut through the crowd, find Clara and the twins, and linger for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a look of affection, but of possession, a king checking on his most vulnerable treasures. "Clara, I'm thirsty," Tessa whispered, her voice barely audible over the swelling quintet. Clara smiled, a gentle, grounding expression that masked her own growing unease. The radiant shield was in full effect. "I'll get you some juice, sweetheart. Stay right here with Theo. Don't move from this pillar." As Clara stepped toward the refreshment table, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a loud change. It was the sudden, unnatural silence of a predator entering the brush. She saw it before anyone else did, a waiter in a stiff white jacket moving with a focused, mechanical gait that didn't match the fluid service of the others. He wasn't looking at the guests. He was looking at the gap between the pillars where the heirs of the Kwon Empire stood. Time seemed to fracture into slow-motion frames. The waiter reached into his serving towel, and the matte black finish of a suppressed pistol caught the light. Clara didn't scream. There was no time for a warning that wouldn't be understood fast enough. In a city of giants and monsters, Clara had always been the invisible one, the ghost who observed from the sidelines. But as the assassin leveled the barrel at the small, unsuspecting forms of Theo and Tessa, the fragile tutor vanished. She lunged. It was a frantic, desperate burst of speed that defied her slender frame. She threw her body across the space, her cream blouse fluttering like a broken wing. She reached the twins just as the first suppressed thwip hissed through the air. She didn't feel the impact at first, only the staggering force that spun her around. She gathered both children into her arms, pinning them against the cold marble of the pillar and shielding them with her own spine. The second shot followed instantly. This one burned. It was a searing, white-hot iron that tore through the meat of her shoulder, shattering the quiet elegance of her world. The ballroom erupted. Screams shattered the music, and the heavy thud of combat boots echoed as Jae-hoon's men drew their weapons. But Clara didn't look at the chaos. She looked down at the children tucked beneath her. Tessa was crying, her face buried in Clara's chest, while Theo stared up at his tutor with wide, horrified eyes. "SHH," Clara wheezed, the copper tang of blood rising in her throat. "I've got you, don't look, just stay small." A shadow fell over them, a darkness deeper than the panic of the room. Jae-hoon was there. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. He looked like a god of war. His face was a mask of cold, murderous fury as he stood over them, his own weapon drawn and aimed at the retreating chaos. Behind him, the assassin was already a crumpled heap on the floor, neutralized by the Shadow King's inner circle with brutal efficiency. Jae-hoon knelt, his movements jarringly fast. His large, tattooed hand reached out, hovering over Clara's trembling form. He saw the red blooming across the cream silk of her shoulder, a jagged, visceral stain that marked the end of her quiet life. Clara, he said. The word was a jagged glass rasp. She looked up at him, her pale face slick with cold sweat, her blue eyes hazy but focused. She didn't let go of the children. Even as her strength failed and the world began to gray at the edges, her grip remained a fortress. Are they hurt? She whispered, her voice cracking. Jae-hoon looked at his children, untouched, terrified but alive because of the woman who was currently bleeding out on his shoes. He looked back at Clara, and for the first time the ice in his obsidian eyes didn't just melt, it shattered. He saw her true worth. She wasn't just a tutor, and she wasn't just an employee. She was the only person in his world who had looked at a bullet meant for the king and decided it was worth taking for the sake of 2 children. They are safe, Jae-hoon promised, his voice thick with a sudden, violent protectiveness that wasn't directed at his heirs, but at her. He reached down, his powerful arms sliding beneath her as he lifted her from the floor. He ignored the blood soaking into his expensive charcoal suit, ignored the cameras, and ignored the panicked elite of Seoul. He held her against his chest, her head lolling against his shoulder, her blood staining the crisp white of his shirt. "Hold on, Clara," he murmured into her ear, a command that sounded like a plea. "I do not lose what is mine." As he carried her out of the ballroom, the radiant shield finally flickered. Clara's eyes closed, the last thing she saw being the dark smoke of the Ayers-Yumi dragons on his neck, rising up to meet the neon lights of the city. She had taken the hit, she had saved the heirs, and in that one split-second decision, she had rewritten the destiny of the Kwon family in blood. The tutor was gone, the angel of the Shadow King had arrived. The first thing Clara noticed wasn't the pain, but the silence. It was a heavy, expensive sort of quiet that didn't exist in her cramped apartment near the city's industrial edge. There were no sirens, no rattling subway cars, only the rhythmic, digital pulse of a heart monitor and the faint scent of sterilized linen and expensive wood smoke. When she finally forced her eyes open, the light was soft, filtered through sheer silk curtains that danced in the breeze of a silent climate control system. She was lying in a bed that felt like a cloud, draped in sheets of Egyptian cotton so fine they felt like water against her skin. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe she was still dreaming, but then she tried to shift her weight. A jagged, white-hot bolt of lightning shot from her left shoulder down to her fingertips, forcing a sharp gasp from her lungs. The memory of the gala flooded back, the cold hiss of the suppressed pistol, the weight of the twins in her arms, and the terrifying, obsidian intensity of Kwon Jae-hoon's face as he lifted her from the blood-stained marble. Clara looked down at herself. Her ruined cream blouse was gone, replaced by a soft, charcoal-gray silk robe. A thick, professional bandage was taped securely over her shoulder. She was alive, but as she scanned the room, the luxury began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. The room was vast, decorated in minimalist tones of slate and silver. There were no personal photos, no clutter, only high-end tech and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. In the corner, a large glass wall offered a view of a sprawling estate, complete with manicured Zen gardens and high concrete walls topped with security cameras. This wasn't a hospital. This was the Kwon stronghold. A soft click at the door made her freeze. A man stepped in, but it wasn't the Shadow King. It was a younger man with a wiry build and a face that looked like it had been folded and refolded too many times. He wore a sharp black suit, but his eyes were weary. "You're awake," he said, his voice neutral. "I am Rocco. I oversee Mr. Kwon's personal security. You've been unconscious for 18 hours. "The children," Clara's voice was a dry rasp. "Theo and Tessa, are they?" "They are unharmed," Rocco interrupted, walking to the foot of her bed. He didn't offer a smile. They have been asking for you. But for now, you need to worry about yourself, Miss Thorne. You took a bullet meant for the future of the Quan lineage. In our world, that makes you a hero. It also makes you a very complicated loose end. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. A loose end. I saved them. I don't want anything. I just want to go home. Rocco tilted his head, his gaze sweeping over her. Go home. To the apartment with 3 months of back rent. To the father in the specialized care facility whose bills are being paid by a benefactor you've never met. You don't have a home to go back to, Clara. The people who tried to kill the twins know your face now. If you walk out those gates, you're a target. And if the police get to you first, you're a witness. Neither of those options suits Mr. Quan. The reality of her situation settled in her gut like lead. She hadn't just saved 2 children. She had stepped into the gears of a machine she didn't understand. She was no longer an invisible tutor. She was a variable in a war between shadows. The door opened again, and the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The air seemed to sharpen, the molecules vibrating with a sudden, dark energy. Kwon Jae-hoon walked in. He had traded his gala suit for a black turtleneck and slacks, a look that made him appear even more formidable. The ink of the dragons on his neck seemed to pulse in the soft light. Rocco bowed low and exited without a word, leaving Clara alone with the man who ruled the city. Jae-hoon didn't speak at first. He walked to the window, looking out over his domain, his hands clasped behind his back. The platinum signet ring on his pinky glinted. The doctor says you were lucky, Jae-hoon said, his back still turned. The bullet missed the bone by less than an inch. You have a high threshold for pain. I didn't do it because I was brave, Clara whispered, clutching the silk sheets with her good hand. I did it because they're just children. They shouldn't have to see what a bullet does. Jae-hoon turned. His obsidian eyes were unreadable, but there was a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there at the academy. He moved toward the bed, his predatory efficiency replaced by a slow, deliberate stride. He stopped at her bedside and looked down at her. For the first time, Clara saw a flicker of something human in the depths of his gaze, a reluctant respect. In my world, loyalty is bought or forced, Jae-hoon said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate vibration. Selflessness is a fairy tale, and yet, a woman who owes me nothing nearly died for my blood. Why? Because they matter, Clara said, her blue eyes meeting his with a stubbornness that surprised even her. Even if you don't think so, their lives are worth more than your wars. Jae-hoon leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could smell the sandalwood and the faint, metallic scent of the city on him. He reached out, his large, tattooed hand hovering near her cheek before he pulled it back, as if afraid his touch might break the fragile peace of the room. You are a complication, Clara Thorne, he murmured. My advisors want you handled. They see a witness. They see a liability. And what do you see? Jae-hoon remained silent for a long moment, the digital pulse of the monitor the only sound between them. I see the only person my daughter has smiled at in a year. I see a woman who found a leak in my security before my own captains did. He straightened up, the mask of the Shadow King sliding back into place. You will stay here. You will be cared for. You will continue the children's lessons when you are able. And if I refuse? Jae-hoon reached the door and paused, his hand on the handle. He didn't look back. You won't, because you know as well as I do that the moment you leave this fortress of silk, you are already dead. Here you are mine, and I do not let what is mine be destroyed. The door clicked shut, leaving Clara alone in the luxury. She looked at her bandaged shoulder, the red stain of the previous night gone, replaced by clean white gauze. She was safe, she was pampered, and she was utterly trapped. The radiant shield had saved the heirs, but in doing so, she had become the property of the king. As the sun began to set over Seoul, casting long, orange shadows across the Zen garden, Clara realized that the bullet hadn't just torn through her flesh. It had severed her connection to the world she knew. She was a ghost in a palace, a loose end in a silk knot, waiting to see if the man with the dragon tattoos would be her savior or her executioner. The third day in the Kwon estate brought a different kind of fever, not the burning heat of the wound, but the suffocating restlessness of a bird trapped in a cage of gold and glass. Clara sat by the window of her suite, the gray silk of her robe pooling around her like a shadow. Her left arm was immobilized in a sling, a constant reminder of the metal that had torn through her life, but it was the silence of the mansion that truly unnerved her. It was a silence that felt heavy with the weight of unsaid things, and the ghost of the man who ruled this mountain. A sharp, rhythmic rapping at the door preceded Jae-hoon's entrance. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the room, stripping off his charcoal suit jacket and tossing it onto a chair with a casualness that felt calculated. Underneath, he wore a thin black silk shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. For the first time, Clara saw the true extent of the Ayers-Yumi tattoos. They weren't just decorative, they were a second skin. Intricate dragons with scales of deep indigo and eyes of crimson coiled around his forearms, their claws dipping toward his wrists, disappearing beneath his platinum signet ring. "The doctor says you refused the morphine this morning," Jae-hoon said. He didn't look at her. He walked to the small table where her medical chart lay and began flipping through it with predatory efficiency. "I don't like the way it makes the world feel," Clara replied, her voice firmer than it had been since the shooting. "I've spent enough of my life feeling like I'm underwater. I'd rather feel the pain and know I'm awake." Jae-hoon paused, his dark obsidian eyes lifting to meet hers. He studied her for a long moment, a look of clinical assessment that slowly morphed into something sharper, something more intimate. He pulled a chair across the floor, the screech of wood on marble echoing in the silent room, and sat directly across from her. He was so close she could see the faint, jagged scar at the edge of his jawline, and the way his pupils dilated as they locked onto her blue eyes. "You said you weren't afraid of me," he murmured, his voice a low, magnetic vibration. "But everyone is afraid of something, Clara. I've spent the last few hours looking into the nothing you claim to be. A tutor with no family left in Seoul. A woman who sends 60% of her paycheck to a private clinic in London. A woman who lives in a neighborhood where even the police don't walk after midnight." Clara felt a cold prickle of exposure. "Is this an interrogation, Mr. Kwon? Should I expect a bright light and a pair of pliers?" "If I wanted to hurt you, you wouldn't be sitting in silk," he countered, his gaze dropping to the bandage on her shoulder. "I want to know why a woman who has nothing to lose would give her life for a man she barely knows. People don't jump in front of bullets for legitimate shipping moguls. They do it for people they love, or they do it because they have a death wish. Which is it?" "It wasn't for you," Clara snapped, the heat rising in her cheeks. "It was for Theo and Tessa. You see them as heirs. You see them as a legacy to be protected like a pile of gold in a vault. I see two children who are lonely in a house full of bodyguards. I didn't think about the bullet. I thought about the fact that they are 5 years old and they deserve to grow up." Jae-hoon leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. The movement caused his shirt to tighten across his broad shoulders, and the ink on his arm seemed to move with his muscles. The dragon on his right arm appeared to breathe as he reached out, his hand hovering inches from the sling. "Look at me," he commanded. Clara didn't look away. The air between them grew thick, charged with a magnetic pull that made her breath hitch. In the high-stakes world of the Korean underworld, Jae-hoon was a man of iron and blood, a king who had climbed a mountain of corpses to reach his throne. But in the quiet of this room, with the sun setting over the Zen garden, he looked at Clara and saw something he hadn't encountered in decades: a mirror. "You think we are different," Jae-hoon said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He turned his arm, showing her the underside of his wrist. Amidst the swirling waves of the tattoo was a small, scorched mark, a burn from a cigarette, old and weathered. "I was 6 when I learned that the only way to protect what you love is to become the thing people fear. You took a bullet because you have the same sickness I do. You think you can save the world by standing in front of it." He reached out then, his fingers brushing against the soft skin of her neck, just above the collar of her robe. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence she knew his hands were capable of. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't pull away. The predatory efficiency was gone, replaced by a raw, mutual recognition. They were both ghosts, a ghost of the middle class drowning in debt, he a ghost of the underworld drowning in power. "I see your worth, Clara Thorne," he said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "It isn't in your tutoring or your modesty. It's in the fact that you are the only person in this city who isn't looking at my crown. You're looking at the man beneath it." Clara felt a dangerous, dizzying pull toward him. She saw the ink on his neck, the traditional Ayers-yumi that spoke of rank and history, but she also saw the exhaustion in his eyes. He was a man who had built a fortress to keep the world out, only to find himself trapped inside it. "And what does the man see?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. Jae-hoon didn't answer with words. He leaned in closer, his forehead almost touching hers. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain enveloped her. For a heartbeat, the Shadow King and the Radiant Shield were no longer opposites. They were two sides of the same coin, forged in different fires but tempered by the same weight of responsibility. "He sees a reason to keep the fortress standing," Jae-hoon whispered. He pulled back abruptly, the mask of the Mafia boss sliding back into place as if it had never slipped. He stood up, retrieving his jacket, the charcoal fabric once again hiding the dragons and the history etched into his skin. "Rest, Clara," he said, his tone returning to a professional chill. "The Romanos and the internal leaks, they are my problem. Your only job is to heal, but do not mistake my kindness for a lack of surveillance. You are part of this family now, whether you chose it or not. And in this family, we don't just take bullets for each other. We return them." As the door clicked shut, Clara touched her jaw where his fingers had lingered. The pain in her shoulder was still there, but it was eclipsed by the realization that she had navigated the interrogation and found something far more terrifying than a threat. She had found a connection. The Ayers-yumi secrets weren't just about his past. They were a warning of a future she was now bound to. She was no longer just a loose end. She was the anchor for a king who had forgotten how to feel the ground. And as night fell over the estate, the magnetic pull of Kwon Jae-hoon felt more certain than the rising of the sun. The pain in Clara's shoulder had transitioned from a sharp, electric bite to a dull, rhythmic throb that kept time with the ticking of the grandfather clock in Jae-hoon's private study. She had been moved from the sterile isolation of her bedroom to this sanctuary of dark mahogany and leather, a room that smelled of old parchment and the expensive, cold metallic tang of the Shadow King's presence. Jae-hoon sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian, his charcoal suit jacket discarded. the white silk of his shirt straining against his shoulders as he leaned over a mountain of digital tablets and physical ledgers. "You said you were a tutor," Jae-hoon said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. He didn't look up from the screen. "You didn't mention you had a degree in forensic accounting from the London School of Economics." Clara sat across from him, her left arm still cradled in a silk sling, her right hand resting on a stack of shipping manifests. "I didn't think my academic history was relevant to teaching Theo his multiplication tables, and I didn't finish the degree, Mr. Kwon. My father got sick, and the bank took the tuition money before I could sit for my finals." Jae-hoon finally looked up, his obsidian eyes narrowing as they searched her face. He pushed a tablet across the desk toward her. "My shipping firms are hemorrhaging capital. My captains tell me it's the rising cost of fuel and the Romano family's interference at the docks. My advisors tell me to raise the protection fees on the local vendors to cover the gap. What do you see?" Clara took the tablet, her fingers moving with a practiced, fluid grace that felt more natural than the bandages she wore. She didn't look at the totals, she looked at the margins. For 2 hours, the only sound in the room was the soft tap of her fingernails against the glass and the occasional rustle of paper. Jae-hoon watched her, his chin resting on his hand, the Ayers-Yumi dragons on his arm appearing to coil and uncoil in the shifting lamplight. He wasn't looking at the data. He was looking at the way her brow furrowed in concentration, and the way her fragile exterior seemed to harden into something sharp and clinical. "It's not the fuel," Clara said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "And it's not the Romanos. They're a convenient ghost story your captains are using to keep you looking outward." Jae-hoon stood up, his presence instantly shrinking the room. He walked around the desk, standing behind her, his shadow falling over the ledgers. "Explain." "Look at the miscellaneous wharfage fees for the Busan terminal," Clara said, pointing to a string of numbers that looked innocuous to the untrained eye. "They've increased by exactly 4% every month for the last year. It's too consistent. Real corruption is messy. It fluctuates with the weather and the tides. This is a mathematical formula. Someone is skimming the fat off the top before the cargo even hits the crane. They aren't stealing enough to trigger an alarm, but they're stealing enough to weaken your foundation." She swiped to another screen, her blue eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. "The shell companies receiving these fees are registered to a maritime insurance firm in Hong Kong. I traced the registration numbers back to a holding group. The signature on the primary account isn't a Romano signature. It's internal." Jae-hoon leaned down, his chest nearly brushing her uninjured shoulder. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain enveloped her, making her heart stutter, but she kept her gaze on the numbers. He reached out, his large, tattooed hand covering hers on the tablet, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. The heat of his skin was a stark contrast to the cold obsidian of the desk. "You found in 2 hours what my head of finance couldn't find in 6 months, Jae-hoon whispered, his breath ghosting against her ear. "Maybe they didn't want to find it," Clara countered, turning her head slightly. Their faces were inches apart, the magnetic pull between them more intense than the pain in her body. "In a world of predators, the most dangerous ones are the ones you feed every day." Jae-hoon straightened up, his eyes darkening with a cold, calculated fury that wasn't directed at her. He walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling estate where his guards patrolled with submachine guns. He realized then that Clara Thorne was far more than a radiant shield for his children. She was a weapon he hadn't known he possessed, a mind that could navigate the shadows of his empire with the same ease she navigated the complexities of a child's heart. They think you're a victim, Clara, Jaehoon said, his back to her. They think I brought a broken bird into my nest because I was moved by a momentary act of bravery. They don't realize I've brought in the only person who can see the rot beneath the gold. I'm not a weapon, Jaehoon, Clara said, using his name for the first time without the formal title. He turned, his expression unreadable, though his hand drifted to the signet ring on his pinky. In this house, everyone is a weapon. Some are blades, some are guns. You are the light that shows me where to strike. You've proven your worth today more than the bullet ever could. He walked back to her, reaching into the pocket of his trousers and pulling out a small, velvet-lined box. He set it on top of the ledgers. My daughter wanted you to have this. She said the wooden bird you gave her was lonely. Clara opened the box. Inside was a delicate platinum brooch in the shape of a shield, inlaid with small, brilliant sapphires that matched the color of her eyes. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a mark of protection. I can't accept this, she whispered. You will, Jaehoon commanded, his voice softening. Because as of this moment you are no longer just the tutor. You are my consultant. You will clean my ledgers, you will find the fat, and you will help me cut it out. The man who tried to kill my children is dead, but the man who paid him is still sitting at my table. Find him for me, Clara. Clara looked at the brooch, then back at the man who was quickly becoming the center of her universe. She was a woman who had lived her life in the shadows of debt, but here, in the heart of the underworld, she was finally being seen. She took the brooch and pinned it to her robe, the metal cold against her skin. I'll find him, she promised. The alliance was sealed not with a kiss, but with the cold, hard logic of a balance sheet. As Jaehoon called Rocco into the room to begin the purge of the Busan captains, Clara sat back in the leather chair, her shoulder aching, her heart racing. She had proven she was more than a victim. She was a player in the game of the Shadow King. And as the sun began to set over the horizon, casting long, bloody streaks across the Seoul sky, she knew that the real war had only just begun. The fat was being trimmed, and the blade was in her hand. The recovery at the Kwon estate was a slow, quiet climb out of a fog of pain, but it was the sound of small, frantic footsteps that finally brought Clara back to the living. The heavy oak door of her suite creaked open, and two small figures hesitated in the threshold. Theo was clutching a plastic turbo race car so tightly his knuckles were white, and Tessa was wearing a lacy, lopsided tiara that had clearly been rescued from the bottom of a toy chest. Clara, Tessa whispered, her wide, dark eyes searching the bed. Are you still broken? Clara smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with her medication. She patted the edge of the silk duvet with her uninjured hand. I'm getting much stronger, Tessa, especially now that I have a princess and a race car driver to check on me. The children scrambled onto the bed with a chaotic energy that breathed life into the sterile, high-ceilinged room. For the next hour, the radiant shield was no longer a martyr or a forensic analyst. She was a storyteller. She leaned back against the plush headboard, her honey-blonde hair falling in messy waves as she moderated a high-stakes negotiation between Turbo the car and the Princess of the Tiaras. She didn't notice the heavy shadow in the doorway, nor did the children. Kwon Jae-hoon stood in the hall, his hand frozen on the doorframe. He had come to discuss the latest findings from the Busan docks, his mind a battlefield of internal purges and external threats. He was dressed in a midnight blue suit, his charcoal tie loosened, the Ayers-Yumi dragons on his neck partially obscured by his collar. He was a man who understood power, fear, and the cold logic of survival, but as he watched Clara, he felt a strange, jarring shift in his own internal architecture. Clara was laughing, a soft, melodic sound that seemed to chase the shadows out of the corners of the room. She was helping Theo navigate his car over the mountain of her bandaged shoulder, her face lit with a fierce, protective joy. Tessa had placed the plastic tiara on Clara's head, and instead of looking ridiculous, the tutor looked like a queen who had finally found her kingdom. Jaehoon watched as Theo, the boy he had tried to mold into a stoic heir, leaned his head against Clara's side. He watched as Tessa, who hadn't slept through the night since their mother passed, drifted into a peaceful drowse against Clara's arm. The Shadow King realized then that his fortress of silk and iron was missing the one thing no bodyguard could provide: a heart. He saw Clara's true worth not just in the bullets she took or the ledger she cleaned, but in the way she moved through the wreckage of his world and made it feel like a home. He stepped into the room, his footsteps silent on the marble. Clara looked up, her smile faltering only slightly as she met his obsidian gaze. She didn't take off the plastic tiara. "They missed you," Jaehoon said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate vibration that always made Clara's pulse quicken. "I missed them too," Clara replied, her hand instinctively stroking Theo's dark hair. "They've been through a lot, Jaehoon. They need more than just security. They need to know that the world isn't always trying to hurt them." Jaehoon walked to the side of the bed and looked down at his children. The stoic mask he wore for the city of Seoul didn't quite fit in this space. He sat on the edge of the mattress, the weight of his body shifting the silk sheets. He reached out and touched the plastic car Theo was still holding. "I spent so long trying to make them strong," Jaehoon murmured, his eyes fixed on his son. "I forgot that they were allowed to be small." "You were protecting them the only way you knew how," Clara said softly. "But strength doesn't always look like a gun or a tattoo. Sometimes it looks like a princess crown." Jaehoon looked at her then, and the magnetic pull between them was no longer just about danger or secrets. It was about a shared future. He saw the way she looked at his children, the way she had woven herself into the fabric of their lives in such a short time. He reached out, his large, tattooed hand covering hers where it rested on Theo's shoulder. His thumb traced the line of her knuckles, his skin hot and grounding. "Rocco says the advisor we suspected has gone to ground," Jaehoon said, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. "The fat you found has led us to a series of offshore accounts. We are close to the head of the snake." "Good," Clara said, her blue eyes reflecting a steely resolve. "Because whoever did this doesn't just want your shipping lanes. They wanted to take this away from you." She gestured to the sleeping children. Jaehoon's jaw tightened. "They won't. I've lived my life in the shadows, Clara. I've accepted that I would always be alone in the dark. But you brought the light in with you." He leaned in, his face inches from hers. The scent of sandalwood and the cold, metallic air of the city clung to him, but beneath it was something warmer. He reached up, his fingers brushing the plastic tiara on her head before sliding down to cup her cheek. His thumb traced her lower lip, and Clara felt a dizzying rush of heat. "You aren't just a tutor and you aren't just a consultant," he whispered, his obsidian eyes searching hers. "You are the soul of this house. My children found you first, but I am the one who is going to keep you." The moment was broken by Theo stirring in his sleep, murmuring something about race tracks. Jaehoon pulled back, but he didn't let go of her hand. He stood up, the Shadow King returning, but the ice in his expression was permanently cracked. "Rest now," he commanded, though the edge was gone from his voice. "Tomorrow we go to the Grand Burnham again, not for a gala but to meet the board. You will be by my side, Clara. I want them to see the woman who saved the Kwon name." As he walked out, Clara touched the plastic tiara on her head. She looked at the sleeping children and the vast, beautiful, dangerous estate outside the window. She had come to Seoul to escape a ghost, and instead she had found a family of monsters who treated her like a saint. She knew the peace was temporary, that the turbo and tiaras phase was just the calm before the final confrontation. But as she closed her eyes, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known in years. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was the mother figure to a dynasty and the radiant shield of a king who was finally learning how to love. The turbo car sat on the nightstand, its plastic wheels reflecting the neon glow of the city, a silent witness to the transformation of the Shadow King's heart. The humid air of Seoul had turned electric, heavy with the scent of ozone and the impending storm that always seemed to follow the Shadow King. Inside the Kwon estate, the fortress of silk was no longer a place of quiet recovery. It was a war room. Clara stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her suite, her reflection a stranger to her. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, the fabric dark enough to hide the slight bulge of the bandage still protecting her shoulder. On her lapel, the sapphire shield brooch glinted under the recessed lights, a mark of ownership that felt heavier than the fabric itself. "You look like a queen waiting for a coronation." A voice oiled with false sincerity drifted from the doorway. Clara turned to see Park Min-ho, Jae-hoon's primary legal advisor and the man who had sat at the right hand of the Kwon family for a decade. He was a man of sharp creases and a viper's smile, his eyes always moving, always calculating the cost of the air he breathed. While Jae-hoon was a storm of iron and blood, Min-ho was the silent rot in the floorboards. "I'm just a tutor, Mr. Park," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the way her skin crawled. "I'm only here because Mr. Kwon requested my presence at the Foundation Board meeting." Min-ho stepped into the room, his gait smooth and predatory. He reached out as if to adjust the sapphire brooch, but Clara instinctively stepped back, her blue eyes narrowing. He let his hand fall, the smile never reaching his cold, black eyes. "A tutor who finds forensic accounting errors in the Busan shipping manifests. You underestimate yourself, Miss Thorne, or perhaps you overestimate your safety. You see, the board of directors at the Grand Burnham tonight. They aren't interested in your bravery. They are interested in why the Shadow King has suddenly grown a heart. They see you as a weakness, a crack in the armor." "I am not a crack in anything," Clara said, her chin lifting. "I am the reason his children are still breathing." Min-ho chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "And that is exactly why you must be seen. Jae-hoon wants to keep you in the shadows to protect his radiant shield. But the families, the ones who provide the steel for our ships, they need to know who is whispering in his ear. I've taken the liberty of moving your arrival. You won't be entering through the private service elevator tonight, Clara. You'll be entering through the front doors, with the press, with the cameras, with the Romanos watching." The realization hit Clara like a physical blow. Min-ho wasn't protecting the family, he was exposing her. By forcing her into the public eye, he was painting a target on her back that even Jae-hoon's shadow couldn't hide. He was testing the king's loyalty to a nobody against his loyalty to the empire. "Jae-hoon didn't authorize this," Clara stated, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Jae-hoon is currently occupied with a security breach at the northern terminal," Min-ho said, his smile widening to reveal teeth that looked too white, too perfect. "A breach I ensured would require his personal attention. You are his consultant now, aren't you? A consultant should be able to handle a few flashes of light." Before Clara could protest, the heavy oak doors swung open, and two of Min-ho's personal security detail, men she didn't recognize from Jae-hoon's inner circle, stepped in. They didn't look at her with the respect Rocco did. They looked at her like a piece of evidence. "The car is waiting, Miss Thorne," Min-ho said, gesturing toward the hall. "Let's show Seoul the woman who took a bullet for a ghost. Let's see if the Shadow King comes running when his angel is trapped in the light." The drive to the Grand Burnham Hotel was a blur of neon and dread. Clara sat in the back of the black sedan, her good hand gripping the silk of her dress. She thought of Theo and Tessa, tucked away in the nursery with Rocco's most trusted men, and she realized the Viper had played his hand perfectly. He couldn't kill her inside the fortress, so he was dragging her into the Colosseum. As the car pulled up to the gold-leafed entrance of the hotel, the wall of flashbulbs was blinding. The radiant shield felt suddenly, terrifyingly fragile. The door was pulled open, and the roar of the crowd and the frantic shouting of reporters filled the cabin. "Miss Thorne, is it true you're the new matriarch of the Kwon Foundation?" "Clara, did you take the hit for the heirs or for the king?" Min-ho stepped out first, offering his hand to her with a flourish that was meant for the cameras. He leaned in, his voice a lethal whisper against her ear as the shutters clicked in a rhythmic, violent staccato. "Smile, Clara. The whole world is watching to see if you bleed as beautifully as they say." Clara stepped out onto the red carpet, the heat of the spotlights more intense than the July sun. She felt the eyes of 1,000 strangers on her, but more importantly, she felt the eyes of the hidden enemies, the Romanos and the traitors, who were now recording every inch of her face. She looked up at the grand balcony of the hotel, hoping to see the charcoal suit and obsidian eyes of the man who had promised she was his. But the balcony was empty. Min-ho's hand remained on her elbow, his grip tight enough to bruise. He led her through the gauntlet of the press, his viper's smile captured in 100 frames, a silent declaration of war against his own boss. He was forcing Jae-hoon's hand, making her a public liability that the board would demand be removed. As they reached the heavy brass doors of the ballroom, the noise of the press faded, replaced by the suffocating, judgmental silence of the Korean elite. The board of directors sat at a long, U-shaped table of polished marble, their faces as unreadable as the statues in the Zen garden. At the head of the table sat an empty chair, Jae-hoon's chair. Min-ho pulled out a seat for Clara directly in the center of the room, under the glare of a massive crystal chandelier. She was a specimen on a slide, a loose end draped in midnight silk. "Gentlemen," Min-ho announced, his voice echoing with a theatrical gravity, "I present to you the woman who has rewritten our security protocols, the woman who has the king's ear, Clara Thorne." Clara sat, her back straight, her hand resting over the sapphire brooch. She could feel the magnetic pull of the trap closing around her. She was in the light now, stripped of her invisibility, and as she looked at the cold, calculating faces of the men who ruled the city's trade, she realized that the bullet in the club had been the easy part. Survival in the dark was a matter of reflex. Survival in the light was a matter of soul. She looked at Min-ho, who was now leaning against the wall, watching her with a sickeningly satisfied expression. He thought he had won. He thought he had turned the angel into a sacrificial lamb. But as Clara felt the dull throb in her shoulder, she remembered the Ayers-Yumi dragons on Jae-hoon's neck and the cold logic of the ledgers she had cleaned. She wasn't just a tutor anymore. "I believe," Clara said, her voice cutting through the room with a clarity that made the board members stir, "that we were here to discuss the 4% discrepancy in the Busan shipping margins. Or would you rather continue discussing my dress?" The viper's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Clara realized then that the only way to survive the light was to burn brighter than the flashbulbs. She was a loose end, yes, but she was a loose end that could tie a noose. And as the distant sound of a private elevator chimed at the back of the hall, she knew the Shadow King was coming. The war was no longer in the alleys. It was on the stage. The brass doors of the Grand Burnham Ballroom didn't just open. They groaned under the weight of a century of secrets. As Clara stepped inside, the air shifted from the frantic, humid heat of the paparazzi line to a chilled, sterile elegance that smelled of expensive lilies and old, drying ink. This was the night of the five families, a rare, precarious summit where the legitimate fronts of Seoul's underworld gathered to divide the spoils of the city. To the world, it was a charity gala. To the men in the room, it was a counting house. Clara felt every eye in the room hook into her like a barb. The board of directors, gray-haired men with faces like parched leather, sat alongside the representatives of the other four syndicates. They weren't looking at her as a hero. They were looking at her as a vulnerability, a radiant shield that had dared to block a bullet meant for a dynasty. Beside her, Park Min-ho leaned in, his viper's smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Head high, Clara," he whispered, his hand tightening on her elbow. "In this room, if you don't look like a queen, they'll treat you like a carcass." He led her toward the center of the hall, where a circular table of white marble stood under the gargantuan crystal chandelier. There were 6 chairs. 5 were occupied by the heads of the most powerful families in South Korea. The 6th, carved from dark cherry wood and embossed with the silver crane of the Kwon lineage, was empty. Min-ho didn't lead her to a side chair. He pulled out the seat directly to the right of the empty throne. "Sit," he commanded softly. Clara sat, her midnight blue silk gown shimmering like deep water. She felt small against the giants of the underworld, but she kept her spine straight, her right hand resting over the sapphire brooch. To her left sat Elder Shin, a man whose family controlled the northern construction ports. He leaned forward, his eyes milky with age but sharp with malice. "So," Shin rasped, his voice like sandpaper on stone, "this is the girl who makes the Shadow King bleed. I expected something more substantial. You look like you would break in a stiff breeze, Miss Thorne." "I've already proven I don't break under lead, Elder Shin," Clara replied, her voice echoing with a clarity that silenced the low hum of the room. "A breeze shouldn't be an issue." A ripple of cold amusement went through the table. Min-ho took his place standing behind her, playing the role of the loyal advisor, though Clara could feel the heat of his treachery radiating off his suit. He was forcing her to play the role of the claimed woman, Jae-hoon's chosen consort, knowing that the other families would see it as a declaration of war. If Jae-hoon had elevated a nobody to this level, it meant he was no longer thinking with the cold logic of a king. "Jae-hoon is late," remarked a younger man across the table, his fingers tracing a jagged scar on his temple. This was Kang of the Southern District. "Perhaps he's found that his angel is too heavy a burden to carry into a storm." "He isn't late," Clara said, her blue eyes locking onto Kang. "He's ensuring that the bridge you're trying to burn stays standing." Before Kang could retort, the heavy doors at the far end of the ballroom didn't just open, they were thrown wide. The sound of combat boots on marble cut through the classical music like a gunshot. Kwon Jae-hoon entered the room. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was in his charcoal three-piece suit, his tie gone, his white shirt stained with the grease and grit of the docks. He looked like a man who had just come from a battlefield. And the obsidian fire in his eyes suggested he was ready to start another one. The room went deathly silent. Rocco and 4 of the Shadow King's most elite guards fanned out behind him, their hands hovering near their holsters. Jaehoon didn't look at the board. He didn't look at Elder Shin. He walked straight to the center of the room, his gaze fixed on Clara. The magnetic pull was instantaneous. Clara felt the air rush back into her lungs as he approached. He stopped behind her chair, his large, tattooed hand coming down to rest on her uninjured shoulder. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a heavy, possessive claim. The Ayers-Yumi dragons on his neck seemed to pulse in the harsh light of the chandelier. "Park," Jaehoon said, his voice a low, lethal growl that made Minho flinch. "I don't recall authorizing a public entrance for Miss Thorne." "The press was unavoidable, Jaehoon," Minho stammered, his viper's smile finally beginning to fray at the edges. "The board demanded to see the woman who—" "The board demands nothing from me," Jaehoon interrupted, his hand tightening on Clara's shoulder. He looked at the 5 families, his expression one of pure, unadulterated cold. "You see this woman, you see the mark she wears," he gestured to the sapphire brooch. "She is not a tutor, she is not a witness. She is the soul of the Kwon family. If any of you or anyone in your service so much as looks at her with a shadow in your heart, I will not just start a war, I will end your lineages." Elder Shin scoffed. "You claim a foreigner, Jaehoon. You compromise the stability of the 5 for a girl you found in a classroom." Jaehoon leaned over the table, his face inches from the elders. "I found a woman who did what none of your sons would do. She stood in the gap, and now she stays by my side. If that compromises your stability, then your foundations were already rotten." He turned back to Clara, his obsidian eyes softening for the briefest of seconds. He reached down and took her hand, pulling her to her feet. The claimed woman was no longer a role she was playing. It was a reality she was living. In front of the most dangerous men in Asia, the Shadow King was holding her hand like she was the only thing of value in a room full of gold. "We're leaving," Jaehoon announced to the room. "The vote, Jaehoon," Kang shouted, standing up. "The shipping margins, the Romano threat." "The margins are being cleaned," Jaehoon said, looking back over his shoulder, his voice echoing with a terrifying finality. "And as for the Romanos, tell them the Shadow King has found his shield, and she's much sharper than she looks." He led Clara out of the ballroom, his hand never leaving hers. They ignored the flashbulbs of the press who were still gathered at the doors. They ignored the whispers of the elite. As they reached the private elevator, the doors sliding shut on the chaos of the gala, the tension finally snapped. Clara leaned against the wood-paneled wall of the elevator, her heart racing. Minho did this. He wanted them to see me. He wanted them to hate me. Jaehoon stepped into her space, his presence overwhelming the small car. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his touch hot and grounding. "I know, and he will answer for it. But he made one mistake, Clara." "What's that?" "He thought that showing you to the world would make me hide you," Jaehoon whispered, his forehead leaning against hers. "He didn't realize it would only make me want to burn the world down to keep you." The elevator chimed, but neither of them moved. The night of the 5 families had been intended to be Clara's execution. Instead, it had been her coronation. She was the claimed woman of the Shadow King, and as the car descended toward the safety of the dark, Clara realized that the war had moved from the ledgers to the blood. She wasn't just a shield anymore. She was the reason the king was still standing, and for that, the underworld would never forgive her. But as Jaehoon's hand slid into her hair, she found she didn't care about their forgiveness. She only cared about the man with the dragons on his skin. The humidity of the Soul Night had finally broken into a torrential downpour. the kind of rain that turned the neon lights of the Incheon docks into bleeding smears of pink and blue. Clara sat in the back of the armored sedan, her fingers tracing the sapphire brooch on her lapel. Beside her, Park Min-ho was silent, his viper smile replaced by a focused, clinical coldness. He had convinced Jae-hoon that a final, face-to-face meeting with the disgruntled Busan union leads was the only way to solidify the new shipping margins. Jae-hoon had gone ahead with Rocco in a separate lead car, leaving Clara to follow with the trusted legal advisor. As the sedan veered away from the main terminal and toward a secluded row of rusted shipping containers, the first spike of dread pierced Clara's chest. This wasn't where the union met. This was the graveyard of the harbor, a place where the salt air was thick enough to choke on, and the cranes loomed like skeletal giants against the black sky. "Mr. Park, this isn't the way," Clara said, her voice dropping into the steady, analytical tone she used for the ledgers. "The route has been changed for security, Miss Thorne," Min-ho replied without looking at her. "The Shadow King is already waiting." The car came to a jarring halt in front of loading dock 14. The driver, a man Clara didn't recognize from the estate, stepped out and opened her door. The rain lashed at her face, instantly soaking her midnight blue silk gown. Min-ho stepped out behind her, his umbrella casting a shadow over his sharp, predatory features. "Walk," he commanded. They entered the warehouse, a cavernous space filled with the smell of diesel and rotting fish. There was no sign of Jae-hoon, no sign of Rocco. Instead, standing under a single, flickering halogen light, were 4 men in the gray utility jackets of the Romano faction. They weren't holding union papers, they were holding silenced submachine guns. "Where is Jae-hoon?" Clara asked, her blue eyes narrowing as she looked at Min-ho. Min-ho stepped away from her, his umbrella shielding him from a leak in the roof. "Jae-hoon is currently chasing a ghost at the northern terminal. By the time he realizes the security breach was a diversion, the radiant shield will be nothing more than a headline, a tragic casualty of the Romano War. It's poetic, really. The girl who saved the heirs dies because the king couldn't save her." "You're the fat," Clara said, the realization clicking into place with the cold logic of a balance sheet. "The 4% discrepancy. You weren't just skimming for money, you were building a war chest to buy the board's loyalty." Min-ho's smile returned, a thin, lethal line. "I've spent 10 years in the shadow of a man who thinks he's a god. I'm tired of the dark. The Romanos offered me a seat at the table. You, however, offered me a problem. You saw the numbers. You gave him a heart. And a king with a heart is a king who can be toppled." He nodded to the gunmen. "Make it look like a struggle. I want the Romanos to get the credit, but I want Jae-hoon to feel the failure." As the gunmen stepped forward, Clara felt the surge of adrenaline that had sustained her at the gala. She wasn't a warrior, but she was a survivor. She looked at the environment with the same forensic precision she used for the books. To her left, a stack of industrial-sized drums of cooking oil waiting for export. Above her, a rusted iron chain dangling from a motorized pulley. She didn't wait for them to reach her. "You missed one detail in the ledgers, Min-ho," Clara shouted over the roar of the rain on the tin roof. She lunged toward the control panel on the wall, her good hand slamming into the emergency release lever for the overhead crane. The heavy iron hook swung with a violent, screeching momentum, catching the lead gunman in the chest and sending him flying into a stack of wooden crates. In the chaos, Clara grabbed a heavy industrial flare from a nearby safety rack. She didn't run for the door. They would catch her in the open. Instead, she dived behind the oil drums. The gunmen opened fire, the suppressed thwip-thwip of their rounds punching holes into the metal containers. Thick, slick oil began to pour across the concrete floor. Clara struck the flare. The brilliant, blinding red light illuminated the warehouse in a hellish glow. "You said I was a crack in the armor, Min-ho," she yelled, her voice echoing through the rafters. "But a crack is where the fire gets in." She threw the flare into the spreading pool of oil. The flashpoint wasn't immediate, but the heat caused the fumes to ignite in a sudden, roaring wall of orange flame. The Romanos hissed in surprise, slipping on the slick surface as the fire raced toward the remaining drums. Clara scrambled upward, using a rusted ladder to reach the second-story catwalk. Her shoulder screamed in protest, the bandage soaking through with fresh blood, but she didn't stop. She looked down to see Min-ho standing near the exit, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage as his viper's smile burned away in the heat. "Kill her," he screamed, his voice breaking. "Kill her now." One of the gunmen leveled his weapon at the catwalk, but the smoke was too thick. Clara didn't wait for a second chance. She reached the heavy loading doors at the rear of the second floor and threw the bolt. The cold night air hit her like a blessing. Below her was a pile of discarded shipping pallets and the dark, churning water of the harbor. She heard the heavy thud of boots on the catwalk behind her. She didn't look back. She thought of the plastic tiara on her dresser and the obsidian eyes of the man who had promised her she was his. She jumped. The impact with the water was a bone-deep shock, the cold instantly numbing her limbs. She surfaced, gasping for air, and swam with a desperate, single-minded focus toward the shadows of a neighboring pier. Behind her, Dock 14 erupted in a secondary explosion as the oil drums finally gave way, a pillar of fire rising up to meet the rain. She pulled herself onto a rusted ladder at the far pier, her midnight blue dress heavy and torn, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She looked back at the burning warehouse, expecting to see her executioners. Instead, she saw the headlights of a dozen black SUVs screaming into the lot. A lone figure stepped out of the lead car before it had even come to a full stop. Even from the distance, she recognized the silhouette, the broad shoulders, the predatory grace, and the sheer, terrifying power of the Shadow King. Jae-hoon stood in the firelight, his charcoal suit jacket gone, his white shirt glowing red in the reflection of the flames. He didn't look like a businessman or a mogul. He looked like the devil coming to collect a debt. Behind him, Rocco and a dozen men moved into the warehouse like a scythe through wheat. Clara collapsed onto the wet wood of the pier, her strength finally failing. She watched as Jae-hoon sprinted toward the water's edge, his eyes scanning the dark waves with a desperation she had never seen on a human face. "Clara," his voice tore through the sound of the sirens and the rain. "I'm here," she tried to shout, but it came out as a whisper. She raised her good hand, the sapphire brooch catching a stray spark from the fire. He saw her. Jae-hoon didn't wait for his men. He vaulted over the pier railing, dropping onto the slick wood beside her. He gathered her into his arms, his large, tattooed hands shaking as they pressed her against his chest. He was soaked, he was covered in soot, and he was holding her with a ferocity that suggested he would never let the world see her again. "He was the fat Jae-hoon," she wheezed, her head lolling against his shoulder. "Min-ho, he was the leak." "I know," Jae-hoon whispered, his forehead pressing against hers, his obsidian eyes burning with a dark, satisfied justice. "Rocco found the accounts, and now I'm going to make sure the Viper never smiles again." He lifted her up, his powerful arms a fortress that no bullet or betrayal could penetrate. As he carried her toward the waiting cars, the fire at Dock 14 began to die down under the relentless soul rain. The trap had been sprung, the traitors exposed, and the radiant shield had proven that her true worth wasn't in her silence, but in her fire. The Shadow King had his angel back, and as the sirens faded into the distance, Clara knew that the time for hiding was over. The war was won, and the new era of the Kwon family was about to be written in something much stronger than ink. The storm that had nearly swallowed the Incheon docks was now a memory, replaced by a crystalline silence that only the first true snowfall of December could bring. Seoul was transformed, the neon glare of the city softened by a layer of white that covered the grime of the alleys and the scars of the harbor. At the Kwon estate, the fortress of silk had become a sanctuary of light. Inside, the scent of pine and cinnamon drifted through the halls, a stark contrast to the diesel and iron that had defined the months prior. Clara stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the main drawing room, her left shoulder finally free of the sling. She wore a dress of cream cashmere, soft and modest, yet it was pinned with the sapphire shield brooch that had become her unofficial crest. The medical debts were a ghost of the past, settled by a consultancy fee that Jae-hoon had insisted was merely a down payment on her worth. But as she watched the snowflakes dance against the glass, she wasn't thinking about the money. She was thinking about the man who had traded his crown for a heart. The internal purge had been absolute. Park Min-ho had vanished into the legal abyss he had helped create, his viper's smile erased by the evidence Clara had unearthed. The Romanos had retreated to the shadows, broken by a Shadow King who no longer fought just for territory, but for the woman who had taught his children how to laugh again. Clara looked turbo as a hat. Theo skidded across the polished marble floor, holding up his plastic race car, which now sported a tiny, hand-knitted red cap. Behind him, Tessa followed with a grace that was starting to mirror Clara's own, her lace-trimmed dress sparkling with the reflection of the massive Christmas tree in the center of the room. "It's a very fast hat, Theo," Clara laughed, kneeling to meet them. She didn't flinch when Theo hugged her. The physical pain was gone, replaced by a bone-deep sense of belonging. "Papa says it's time," Tessa whispered, her dark eyes bright with a secret. Clara looked up to see Kwon Jae-hoon standing in the arched doorway. He had traded his charcoal suits for a midnight blue sweater and slacks, a look that made him appear approachable, yet no less formidable. The Ayers-Yumi dragons on his neck were partially hidden by his collar, but the platinum signet ring on his pinky glinted in the firelight. He didn't look like a mafia boss. He looked like a man who had finally found the ground beneath his feet. "The children have something for you," Jae-hoon said, his voice a low, warm vibration that still made Clara's heart skip a beat. Theo and Tessa reached into a velvet-lined box beneath the tree and pulled out a small, handmade ornament. It was a wooden bird, similar to the one Clara had first given them, but it was painted gold and wore a tiny sapphire shield around its neck. "For our angel," Tessa said solemnly, placing the ornament in Clara's hand. Clara felt the tears prickling her eyes. She had come to this house as a ghost, a woman drowning in the expectations of a world that didn't see her. Now, she was the anchor for the most powerful family in the city. She looked at Jae-hoon, and the magnetic pull between them was a physical force, drawing her toward the man who had seen her true worth before she had even seen it herself. Jae-hoon walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the marble. He took the wooden bird from her hand and placed it on a prominent branch of the tree. Then he turned to her, his obsidian eyes unreadable but burning with a fire that was purely for her. "The war is over, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that the children couldn't hear. "The 5 families have signed the peace, and the Busan docks are clean, but there is one final ledger I need to settle." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, square box. He didn't kneel. The Shadow King didn't bow to anyone, but the way he held the box was an act of total surrender. He opened it to reveal a ring of platinum, set with a diamond as clear and bright as the winter stars. "You took a bullet for my blood," Jae-hoon said, his large, tattooed hand taking hers. His skin was hot against the winter chill. "You found the rod in my house and you cut it out with nothing but your mind. My children love you, and I—" He paused, the mask of the king slipping to reveal the raw, vulnerable man beneath. "I cannot imagine a world where you are not the light in my shadow. Will you stay, not as a tutor, not as a consultant, but as a Kwon?" The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. Clara looked at the man who had been her executioner, her savior, and finally her home. She looked at the twins, who were watching with bated breath, Theo still clutching his turbo car. "Yes," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. I'll stay with all of you." Jae-hoon slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, a weight that anchored her to this new reality. He leaned in, his forehead pressing against hers, the scent of sandalwood and cold pine enveloping her. "I told you once that I do not let what is mine be destroyed." He murmured against her lips. "I lied. I don't just protect you, Clara. I belong to you." He kissed her then, a deep, passionate seal on a pact that was stronger than blood, stronger than money, and stronger than bullets. It was a kiss that spoke of neon nights and silk fortresses, of forensic accounting and plastic tiaras. "Finally," Theo cheered, throwing his hands up in the air. "Does this mean we can open the big boxes now?" Clara broke the kiss, laughing against Jae-hoon's lips. "Yes, Theo, we can open the big boxes." Outside, the snow continued to fall on Seoul, covering the grime, covering the blood, leaving everything white and new. The radiant shield had finally found her wings, and the Shadow King had found his heart. For the first time in the history of the Kwon family, there was a peace that didn't require a gun to maintain. It made you wonder, looking at the golden bird on the tree. If you saw a world of monsters and shadows, would you have the courage to dive in? Or do we only find out who we really are when we realize that the most dangerous man in the city is the only one who can truly see us? Clara Thorne looked at the ring on her finger and then at the man by her side. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a Kwon. And as the children's laughter filled the hall, she knew that the story that had started with a suppressed shot in a ballroom had ended with a love that could burn down an empire and build a home in its place.